Hello, dear subscribers and guests of the channel. A space rocket is an aircraft moving in space due to the action of reactive thrust, which occurs only as a result of the rejection of part of its own mass working fluid of the device and without the use of substances from the environment. Since rocket flight does not require the presence of an ambient air or gas environment, it is possible not only in the atmosphere, but also in a vacuum. The creation of space rockets is a complex and multifaceted engineering process that requires considerable effort and knowledge, which includes the development of structures, engines, control systems, and navigation. Rocket designs should be sturdy but lightweight. The flight characteristics of a rocket directly depend on its mass. A number of mass ratios are used to characterize the mass of the rocket structure. The distribution of the mass of the structure also affects the center of gravity of the rocket, which, in turn, affects its stability and controllability. During the rocket's flight into orbit, some parts of the structure are dropped in a process called stage separation. How did a person come up with such a rocket design? No one came up with such a rocket right away. History. The first rockets were used for fireworks. There is an assumption that some kind of rocket was designed in ancient Greece. We are talking about the flying wooden pigeon of Archytas of Tarentum, Greek. His invention is mentioned in the work of the ancient Roman writer Aulus Gellius, Latin Aulus Gellius, Attic Knights, Latin Nox Atticae. The book says that the bird rose with the help of weights and was set in motion by a puff of hidden air. It has not yet been established whether the pigeon was set in motion by the action of the air inside it or the air that blew on it from the outside. It remains unclear how Ockett could have obtained compressed air inside the pigeon. In the ancient tradition of pneumatics, there are no analogues of such use of compressed air. An early Chinese rocket. The origins of rockets are attributed by most historians to the time of the Chinese Han Dynasty 206 BC to 220 AD, to the discovery of gunpowder and the beginning of its use for fireworks and entertainment. The force generated by the explosion of the powder charge was sufficient to move various objects. Later, this principle was applied in the creation of the first cannons and muskets. The projectiles of powder weapons could fly over long distances, but they were not rockets because they did not have their own fuel reserves. Nevertheless, it was the invention of gunpowder that became the main prerequisite for the emergence of real rockets. The description of the flying fire arrows used by the Chinese shows that these arrows were rockets. A tube made of thickened paper, open only from the rear end and filled with a combustible compound, was attached to them. This charge was ignited, and then the arrow was released using a bow. Such arrows were used in a number of cases during the siege of fortifications, against ships and cavalry. In the 13th century, together with the Mongol conquerors, rockets reached Europe, and in 1248, the English philosopher and naturalist Roger Bacon published a work on their use. Multi-stage rockets were described in the 16th century by Konrad Haas and in the 17th century by the Belarusian Lithuanian military engineer Kazimir Semenovich. Sketches and drawings of the first multi-stage rockets appeared in the works of military technician Konrad Haas in 1556 and scientist Kazimir Semenovich in 1650. According to many experts, he is the first inventor of a multi-stage rocket. But these were military engineering projects. Neither Haas nor Semenovich envisioned their use for space purposes. He was the first to propose the idea of using a multi-stage rocket to fly into space in the 17th century. Cyrano de Bergerac in his fantastic story Journey to the Moon in 1648, but the fact is that a conventional multi-stage solid fuel rocket, mostly gunpowder, was not suitable for space flights. A fundamentally different type of fuel was needed. In India, at the end of the 18th century, rocket weapons were used very widely and, in particular, there were special detachments of rocket scientists, the total number of which reached about 5,000 people. Rocket arrows projectiles, which were tubes with a charge of a combustible substance, were used by the Indians in battles with British troops' Mysore rockets. At the beginning of the 19th century, the British Army also adopted combat missiles, the production of which was established by William Congreve rocket. At the same time, Russian officer Alexander Zasyatko was developing a theory of missiles. In particular, he tried to calculate how much gunpowder is needed to launch a rocket to the moon. Konstantin Konstantinov, a Russian artillery general, achieved great success in improving missiles in the middle of the 19th century. The Russian revolutionary inventor Nikolai Ivanovich Kivalchik also put forward the idea of an elementary rocket engine in 1881. Rocket artillery was widely used until the end of the 19th century. Rockets were lighter and more mobile than artillery guns. The accuracy of firing rockets was small, but comparable to artillery guns of that time. However, in the second half of the 19th century, rifled artillery guns appeared, providing greater accuracy of fire, and rocket artillery was decommissioned everywhere. Only fireworks and flares have been preserved. At the end of the 19th century, attempts began to be made to mathematically explain jet propulsion and create more effective missile weapons. In Russia, Nikolai Tikhomirov was one of the first to address this issue in 1894. At the same time, in the USA, Nikola Tesla is designing the first jet-powered devices, the principles of which he developed back in the 70s of the 6th century during his college studies. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, an outstanding scientist and the founder of cosmology, studied the theory of jet propulsion 1857 to 1935. He put forward the idea of using rockets for space flights and argued that the most efficient fuel for them would be a combination of liquid oxygen and hydrogen. He designed a rocket for interplanetary communications in 1903. German scientist Hermann Oberth also outlined the principles of interplanetary flight in the 1920s. In addition, he conducted bench tests of rocket engines. American scientist Robert Goddard began developing a liquid-fueled rocket engine in 1923, and a working prototype was created by the end of 1925. On March 16, 1926, he launched the first liquid rocket, which used gasoline and liquid oxygen as fuel. The work of Tsiolkovsky, Oberth, and Goddard was continued by groups of rocket enthusiasts in the United States, the USSR, and Germany. In addition to the traditionally called three fathers, perhaps we can also name the fourth founder of cosmonautics, Yuri Kondratyuk, who in his work Those Who Will Read to Build gave a schematic diagram and description of a four-stage rocket powered by oxygen-hydrogen fuel. Work on the manuscript began in 1916 and was completed in 1919. Kondratyuk is famous, first of all, for the fact that it was he who calculated the optimal flight path to the moon. These calculations were used by NASA in the Apollo lunar program. The trajectory he proposed in 1916 was later named the Kondratyuk Highway. In the USSR, since 1932, research work has been conducted by the Jet Propulsion Research Group in Moscow and the Gas Dynamics Laboratory in Leningrad. In 1933, the Jet Institute was established on their basis. In the same year, it completed the creation of a fundamentally new rocket weapon, which began in 1929, rockets, the launcher for which later received the nickname Katyusha. It was widely used during the Great Patriotic War. On August 17, 1933, the Gerd-9 rocket was launched, which can be considered the first Soviet anti-aircraft missile. It reached a height of 1.5 kilometers. And the next Gerd-10 rocket, launched on November 25, 1933, has already reached an altitude of 5 kilometers. In Germany, similar work was carried out by the Society for Interplanetary Communications. On March 14, 1931, VFR member Johann Winkler carried out Europe's first successful liquid rocket launch. VFR employed Werner von Braun, who began developing rocket engines at the German Army's artillery range in Kummersdorf in December 1932. The engine he created was used on an experimental A-2 rocket, which was successfully launched from Borkum Island on December 19, 1934. After the Nazis came to power in Germany, funds were allocated for the development of rocket weapons, and in the spring of 1936, a program was approved for the construction of a rocket center in Pienend, of which Walter Dornberger was appointed head and von Braun was appointed technical director. It developed the ballistic missile with a range of 320 kilometers. During World War I, on October 3, 1942, the first successful launch of this rocket took place, and in 1944, its combat use began under the name V2. The military use of the V2 showed the enormous capabilities of rocket technology and the most powerful post-war powers. The United States and the USSR also began developing ballistic missiles. By 1957, in the USSR, under the leadership of Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-7, was created as a means of delivering nuclear weapons. On October 4, 1957, it was used to launch the world's first artificial satellite. This is how the use of rockets for space flights began. Watch my channel and subscribe. You will learn a lot of new and interesting things. Click on the bell to be the first to watch new videos on the channel.